Hello there YouTube hunters, Brad Goodspeed here. So I want to go over a character that I created in 2014 for my friend Skip Willett, who's a great contributor to our haunted house. He was in our haunt the previous year, but he was new to it, so we just threw a costume on him. This year I wanted to create something more custom just for him. So we created this character called Vedmak. This process has a bunch of different steps to it. I think the character came out pretty cool. There was mask making involved, some leather work, some other things. So just going to go over it as briefly as I can, so pay attention, will you? So the first thing I did is sort of start with kind of a clay under sculpt to give a basic idea of the shape of what I wanted to do. At this point I was just feeling of what I wanted to create. And then I eventually took it into like a sketch of, of sort of what I wanted the finished thing to be. I wanted it to have a beard, I wanted it to have this kind of face plate, and the idea is it's supposed to kind of look like my logo for my haunt. After kind of roughing out ideas, what I did is use epoxy sculpt to build on top of that clay under sculpt. Created this sort of basic shape and started dremeling it. Dremel work takes a long time, as with my previous epoxy mask. So then I had to make the horns, and for this I decided to use a material called Warbler, which many of you have probably used before, or have heard of before at least, used in a lot of cosplay stuff. It's just an experiment. But what I did is I took styrofoam and I shaped them into the horns that I wanted, and then I wrapped them in Warbler and started to smooth out the Warbler using my Dremel and a number of other things, Sureform shaver and a few other techniques. As you can see, there's a bunch of tool marks on that Warbler as I was using the side of my Dremel to smooth it out, and over time, again, I eventually got it to where it needed to go. Now, I would not recommend using this technique to make horns. I ended up doing something a lot better on another sculpture that I worked on, where I basically followed Craig Schreiber's idea and built up a horn in aluminum foil and then wrapped that in a soft epoxy sculpt and let it harden, and then you can sand it down to a perfectly smooth finish. The Warbler took a lot of work, little patch jobs and stuff like that to get it relatively smooth. In the end I was pretty happy with it. After doing sort of lots of massaging of the sculpt, I started working on different ideas for adding this leather strap that was in my original design. I ended up canning that idea, but I might add to the mask later on. But then I went through the painting technique that I described in my other epoxy mask video that I talked about, where you do basically a wash of dark paint and then you sand it off so you get the highlights back. And then I did a technique for sort of putting a finish on the Warbler of using golden sandable gesso. This is latex sandable primer, and you have to do coat after coat after coat. Let it cure, do another coat, let it cure, do another coat, let it cure, then sand, and then do that process again a few times. So it took quite a while, but eventually you get a fairly smooth surface on all this Warbler. So eventually I kind of got this glossy coat on there, and I was able to paint it with some sort of textured paint work. The imperfections aren't that obvious. Then you can see I started playing with paint. I ended up doing washes of dark colors. So the next step was creating the beard. My original plan was to have the beard connected to the rigid mask, but I thought that would end up getting destroyed if it was all one piece. So I created this kind of under mask. I just took a bunch of linen, laid it over my head form and strips of linen, and kind of used latex to kind of create the shape of this mask. And then I used Monster Maker's mask hair and just latex that on, and you get this sort of under mask that you can just put the other mask on top of, and then you've got the idea of the beard. I ended up painting that linen a bit to darken it up so that any parts of it that showed through the mask would not register. So the next thing was to create these robes. That's Skip wearing the costume before we've finished all the pieces for it, but just took some fabric, and actually my mother sewed these for me, and then I detailed them up using my typical concoction of tricks, spray paint, actually a little bit of bleach, and tandy leather stain, and a few other things. So the next thing was the leather work. I wanted to create this kind of chest plate and shoulder thing, kind of inspired by Game of Thrones, by the Night's Watch soldiers. They always wear fur and kind of leather and stuff like that. It was a little bit difficult to figure out how to do it, because the Night's Watch furs are held on by this cross pattern of sort of leather straps that go around the chest and then connect at the back, and that's how they're held on. But I couldn't do that because my character was wearing a robe without like real sleeves, or the sleeves, it just would have bunched up and it would look strange. So I did this instead. What I did is basically create a pattern of what I wanted the leather to look like. It was 2 pieces. I did that out of paper, figured out exactly how I wanted them, folded them in half so that they were symmetrical, And then once I was happy with that, I cut out the shapes, you know, made sure that the look was right. And I had this fur. This is a real fur that I found at a thrift shop one day. And I wanted it to kind of hang over the shoulders. So I sort of positioned everything where I wanted it to be and then cut out shapes out of a hide of leather that I have on hand. And I use my scathing tool to take the edges off of it so that it's not sharp at the edge of the leather. And then I drew around the circumference with this piece of plastic as a guide for the depth, and I just use some of my leather mallets to this groove into it. Going around the circumference, pounding away, and eventually you get this sort of pattern here. Once I had my pieces ready, I marked where the holes were going to be, and I put rivets in to connect them. Then I created these two sort of toggles. They're supposed to look like teeth or claws or something like that. I just made them out of epoxy sculpt very quickly. Once they were cured, I created these sort of leather, I don't know what you would call them, but these little leather pieces to go on either side of the fur to create like a firm buttonhole in the fur. So what I would do is just cut a small hole in the piece of fur, put one of these pieces on one side, one on the other, and then pound rivets through so that I had sort of something rigid, because the fur and the skin underneath is quite soft and would tear easily with much strain, and I needed the button from the leather pieces to pass through here and hold it tight. So this leather thing, this two-sided leather thing that I made with the rivets, strengthened it up quite a bit. So I painted those toggles dark brown and sort of ran this wax thread through it, and then ran it through to the leather piece underneath, and the which I had riveted holes into so that the fur and the leather pieces are connected. Finally, I took all this stuff up to the cottage one weekend and started detailing it up, adding sort of blood and gore to the costume and to the furs, and put it all together. And there you go. This is Skip before we actually ended up adding a belt to the character because he looked too wide there. And you know, this is without any makeup on, but Skip looked pretty intimidating on Halloween. He did a great job scaring people as always. And that's it. That's Vedmak. Sorry, I'm not going to go on and on too much longer because it's been long enough, but hopefully that helps you understand the process a little bit of how this character was created. And I have a new character coming for 2015. I'm going to try and create a new character every year. That's going to be my kind of goal. You know, I had one year where I did a bunch all at one time, and then sort of every year I'm creating one highly detailed character like this one was. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry there aren't more of them recently, but hopefully there will be in the time to come. So talk to you all soon, and happy hunting. With the fake ID, 'cause I'm a dead man.